anything final before you wanted to go to questions?
No, not at all. I guess just, well, the one thing is just be mindful the submissions made on the information that we've had at our fingertips. Yep, that's it. But no, over to questions, probably going through those high level points first.
Okay, so just questions around what the ladies have run through with those high level overview comments. And then I understand you've got some more slides which may go down into some detail.
No
more slides.
No.
Oh, right. Okay.
So I think if we do the high level points, we do want particular guidance, as much guidance as we can get from those left, on the regulatory relief and the qualifying resident.
Yep.
Because staff didn't feel comfortable making those calls, and then anything else.
Okay. I know Jen is back, and you did have your light on prior to the leaving. So do you want to ask your question now?
Thank you. So under this new RMA, will we be able to make policy faster and kind of not get bogged down on all the appeals and 10 years and stuff? Or is there no change to that? I couldn't quite pick it from reading.
I'll have a quick first response, then I'll go to Timothy. The intent is definitely to make it faster, speedier. The way and the sequencing, even though I'm totally concur with what Miffy said in terms of the sequencing and just getting things right.
Yeah.
We haven't quite worked out who the chicken and the egg is yet, but in setting up the spatial plan, the natural environments plan, and the land use plan, I think if that's set up properly, it will move things through swifter. The team has mapped out the schedule that states that, and there are some wonky things that kind of send you down ladders and back to go that don't quite make things go as fast. So we've tried to point those out. Sorry, that's a very untechnical way of explaining it. So the intent is definitely there. The timeframes that have been put on by government are hoping to truncate that. Also the separation, the planning tribunal and the environment court and matters that can go to the environment court has tried to truncate that, but I've seen that before as well come through legislation, and it hasn't made a difference. So the intent's there. There's some things that need sharpening up. I don't know. I hope so.
Can't see the path.
Yeah. Miffy, is there anything?
I was just going to add that the way that they have written it, it seems that they're going to, through the national standards, give us a menu of provisions. So if you stick to those provisions that they've given you, then it'll be a much quicker process because you pick that. You don't have to do as much justification because of the standards that are given to you. There might be you have to use this provision, or it might be you have A, B, C to choose from. If you stick to those, they can't be appealed. It's only appeal on points of law. However, if you do want to do bespoke provisions or have specified topics, then you do have to do a justification report, and those are open to merit appeals. So it depends which way you go.
Thank you. I'll keep it brief, but the main feedback is agree with your high level points. The regulatory relief as it is, I think it's good to oppose, but if there was a way of making sure that things were reciprocal, so at the moment it's relief for not being able to use land, I'm really worried that when somebody does damage then the common good resource, that there isn't sufficient way of rectifying that. So it remains a very skewed system, or could be more so even. So there's some changes in that space if that was to come in. And I get the intent of the qualifying resident restrictions, and I quite like it. But obviously, as you said, there's some nuance there to work out so that you do get all the informed voices coming in. But yeah, just on the high level points, I particularly agree with needing to achieve all goals, really worried about those goals that don't have as much voice, such as, nature generally. And then the hierarchy of the plans to each other, because we say in almost every other document that we understand that the things that we want to do with the environment are dependent on that environment actually existing in the first place. So yeah, really, really good points made there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jen. Mikhail.
Yeah, Tracy, just how big of a rabbit hole are the SNAs? You talked about 20,000 properties. Does that include Maryland and their SNAs?
Yeah, just as a base principle, SNAs apply to any type of land with any tenure. How they are managed might differ because of the multiply owned nature of Māori land, but the SNAs apply across the region. We've got them mapped at different levels for different purposes. It would require a significant investment to map at the purposes needed in order to implement it under the regulatory relief. Muffy?
So the figure that is in the submission was a quick figure that our GIS, our spatial team were able to pull for me from what we have mapped, but the districts do have their own mapping, which we often give them some base mapping and then they refine it for their purposes. So that is just to give a rough estimate, but under the regulatory relief as it's currently written, we would have to investigate every single one of those land holdings to determine when they owned the land in relation to when any initial, like any SNA provisions were applied to the land, and then whether they've had any rates relief or anything since then to determine then if they meet the framework. So that was just try to illustrate that if we have to investigate 20,000 properties just for SNAs to determine if they qualify for relief and then determine what level of relief and then inform them all and then potentially negotiate that with the law, they've got a right of reply. So it's a big ask.
And it also, in having a conversation with some of our ICM mates, they were saying, well, what if they've been those people have been successful for Natural Heritage Fund or Environmental Enhancement Fund monies from either Waikato River Authority, other entities and ourselves. Is that double dipping? And so there's a bit to unpick there. Yeah.
Gary.
There's a lot in this, Tracy, and as you guys have stated, fundamentally, I think I really have a problem with the tone of the document. You know, where it says you're supportive, and then pretty well unpick everything that's happening in there. You know, and there is a balance in here between environmental protection and productivity and where we want to go as a country and as a region. And I could go through it point by point, but you seem to be trying to pull back to a defensive position the whole way through it to say that the status quo, we're actually about the environment and all the significant land areas is more important or should have equal weight to productivity and production. And I feel fundamentally where the government wants to go with this, it wants to speed up the process and make our regions more productive, as I do, and that's where I'd definitely be coming from, rather than trying to defend a position of keeping that weighting between significant land areas, sensitive areas, and that higher up. So yes, it is about productivity, it's about timing, and it is about protecting the environment, but it's changing the weighting. And I don't feel any part of your submission has picked up the importance of productivity over protection, and you're trying to defend the status quo. So, and I can go through it point to point, but we'll be here all day because it took me about 3 days to read it and comment on it. And you guys a month to put it together. So, but that's a general thrust.
Yeah, I think it would be useful if there are some points where if you've highlighted something and just flick it, you can either just email it to us so we can grab those, but if there are some particular points to highlight, then it would be really useful.
So I could do that if you want, Warren. I'll go through some of them.
Yep. I'm picking that other councillors will have similar ones on some levels. So and it's helpful to
So
understand.
I'll just start. like 0.70. So I'll just note 0.70 in your submission. I'll go here.
And that's a really good way of helping us navigate too, if you can point to the submission
Yep.
points.
So 0.70, you know, and that is, you know, I fundamentally disagree with where you're coming from there. You know, that you're looking at the whole community thing and the Planning Act and land use and everything else, and weighing that with the environment, you know, and surely this is about productivity, exactly what the bill intent is trying to do. So it is trying to say balance or rebalance that whole issue around the environmental impact and natural environment and development. 0.69, same thing. You know, you're saying development might occur in places where it has unintended consequences, like there could be issues around water and supply and things like that. Well, surely if a developer is going to enter into development, they would have done that as a base of part of their due diligence. They would have gone into that. They would have made sure that there's water, electricity, whatever, you know, anything they need. You know, so that is up to a developer to do that. It's not for us to start telling these people how to do their job and what they should not be doing. So that's another area.
So,
I'll
no,
go.
you go, Tris.
I was just going to say, just on that matter, and I'm not talking about whether there's water availability and so on, but you know, there has been a big issue around the city where developers are getting consents fast tracked, and there is no opportunity for water and wastewater. There is no infrastructure, and it needs to be. You know, that can run into another problem of a lot of sunk money investment. It hasn't been pointed out. But the key thing I just want to point out is, I don't know if you read the media in the last few weeks, there's an issue in Hawke's Bay where a developer went and has bought a block for development, had it approved, has spent a lot of money on it and selling sections, and then has found out that it's a disaster waiting to happen. And can no longer go ahead. So he has taken the Hawke's Bay Regional Council and the Hastings District Council to court on the basis that they had a duty of care, that they should never have allowed that development to go ahead. Hawke's Bay Regional Council actually opposed it, and they still went then. And the developer was saying, "Oh yes, but when the final decision got granted by Hastings District Council, the Regional Council should have appealed it to court and took them to court on the basis it wasn't appealed." Now, whilst the judge threw it out, all I'm saying is that there's a duty of care thing that we've just got to be careful that local government institutions don't get caught up in. Now, it might not be directly relevant to the one that you just said, but if people are going to start building in areas that our advice is that they shouldn't, I'd be quite concerned for the liability in the future.
So there's a lot of parts of that too, Chris, and I get that. You know, I suppose we all think about development, and I'm not sure in what context you're talking about, but I'm definitely not thinking about urban development. I'm thinking about commercial productivity. You know, about whether you open up a mine or whether you build a factory or whatever else. So there are other aspects. You know, so I was thinking really from a productivity point of view, and we were at with that. So probably well. And I suppose your comments are still relevant to that, but I really believe as a country and definitely as a region, if we want to promote the Waikato as a region to do business, we've got to make sure that we're open for business and not putting up roadblocks. And that is what I think. That is where I think the intent of this bill is going. And I still see when I read through the document and the clauses, it very much feels like it's about the status quo rather than saying how do we enable and enact development and progress the Waikato as a region to do business. And same with point 39, Tracy, if I go back to point 39, I feel that is, you know, once again, it just seems really defensive, and it's about the status quo again, rather than saying let's embrace the bill, let's have a look at what it's offering, and how do we work with it, rather than how do we actually just retrench and protect our position. And so that was another point that I thought within their in their recommendation, it should be reframed and reworded in a positive light rather than in a negative light and a defensive. And I just want to reiterate, to me, it's all about promoting the activity. Point 33, I think I just, once again, it's about, point 33 is exactly about what the bill is trying to change, and it's that rebalancing of production and efficiencies of changing the legislation to rebalance or reweight between getting the job done and looking after the environment. So, it's in the same vein. All the points are about the same vein, but these are the key ones that I've picked out. So fundamentally, the thrust of what I'm saying is it's the same on every point. They're the ones that seem to be more about protecting the status quo. 7D, I had a point on 7D. 7D, amending the hierarchy place, once again, same thing, it's amending the hierarchy of place of natural environment plans above plans to ensure that development occurs with environmental limits. And that is the rebalancing that is trying to occur here. And so once again, you're trying to, when I look at your submission, it feels like you're trying to pull back to where the status quo rather than embracing where it's going.
Gary,
Yep.
I would
Go.
say, I've heard you.
Good.
Let us take a swing at it. It is, the legislation is environmental management legislation. It does talk about within environmental limits. It does talk about supporting and enabling economic growth as well. So it is getting that balance right. I guess just with some of them that we do feel as though that, I think in 33 and something Miffy said earlier, those short-term economic results can't be at the expense of long-term, and that's long-term ongoing operations of activities. But we will have a look at the way things are framed, because there does need to be that balance. It is within environmental limits, so unapologetically it does kind of talk about environmental management, but we will go back through and just see if we've got that balance right and some of the messaging right there. But it's really hard, and I'll be honest, it's really hard when the government says you want to go faster, quicker, stronger, get that. But that's good because we're not the regulators. This regional governance entity are the regulators who can make some of those tough decisions. Also, in parts of the bill, they've said it's up to you to allocate water. You've got to allocate it to make sure everybody gets their fair amount, but also the minister can jump in and override your decisions, and the community then has to fund a process to drop it out. So I think, what am I saying? We'll go through and we'll go and we'll have a look at the language to make sure, I think, as you say, to make it more positive where we can, without losing some of the essence. And then we will highlight some of those areas that we're saying, council, these are our jobs, and we have to take a stance like this. We're going to do our job. But I do hear what you're saying, Gary.
Can I have a follow-up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just a quick follow-up on that. If I look back at what we talked about this morning around local government reform and things like that, and when I looked at this submission and I read that, I thought this was just playing into Shane Jones's, Simon Court's, and Chris Bishop's hands, and this was about the status quo. And Shane Jones would pick this up and say, "This is why we need to get rid of the regional council." When I look at the submission, because it's defending and protecting your opposition and you're stifling business, and they've got to go. And I just think, I just think you're just putting petrol on the fire for those guys. And unless we change the tone of it, and that, they're going to have a field day with it.
Yep, I hear that, I accept that, but also I guess professionally we've got to provide you with our best advice on how the system will work and then take your guidance. So, yep, we've heard totally hear what you're saying.
Thanks, Tracy. And I think it's important to acknowledge too that there's the national directions are missing. There's a number of pieces within it that are actually missing that we don't know the detail in as well. A couple of things I'll throw in now while others are thinking about their questions, but I just would suggest that we are very careful with what we recommend around our treaty settlement partners and that sort of thing. Certainly acknowledge those relationships that we have and that are legislated are really important and they work well. But there's some pieces throughout the submission where we say that we don't think 2 years is long enough for the iwi consultation. I mean that both bills, clause 8, 9 and 10 across both bills clearly state that consultation is going to happen. It's between the government and iwi, and I think that needs, that's what we need to recognise is going to happen. We shouldn't start to comment on where we think iwi has capacity or doesn't. I think that's a bit of a slippery slope for us. Unfortunately, our two iwi ward councillors aren't here, but yeah, so that's just a point of me for concern. Tracy, just your impression of, with us losing controlled and non-complying classes, is there a danger that those activities that fell under those classes prior are going to move up in the structure towards prohibited, or would they potentially move down? And I know everything can't move down into permitted. So to me, I can't see clarity on where some of those consents would end up. There seems to be now a bigger gap from discretionary and then up to prohibited. There seems to be quite a large gap there.
I don't think it's an automatic step up. If they're not there, you suddenly don't go up, because the tests in order to write them into a plan are pretty high for a prohibited activity, not the same as if you're writing something for non-complying activity. What it will do is it'll test plan makers going back and understanding, and I haven't read the provisions deeply in terms of making the plans and how you would differentiate between, some of the some of the controlled might become some of these weird permitted activities with registration. I don't know, but it's not as simple as the non-complying jumping up. And really what we would do is again, look at what those effects are and what the Act requires us to manage, because it's going to create a whole different plan making experience for us than what we've had in the past. But there's not an automatic jump up, no.
No, I didn't think there was, but then I couldn't see a pathway either of, actually sort of delineating different.
What this does gives us an opportunity to recast all of that, also to talk with, our decision makers on some of those consents and say, how do they work or don't work? Is it with that view in mind of trying to make things simpler?
Okay, I'll leave my questions here for a moment.
Sorry, Warren, and just the other thing is that, as Miffy said, there'll be a lot more national standards come out that will actually tell us what some of the activities are or not, and if we want to deviate from those, then we'll run through the process that these bills outline.
Yeah. The couple of questions you've got on the screens there and that sort of thing. Regulatory relief, we definitely need to have some really good structured comments around those in that space. That just and I hate putting emphasis on worst case scenario, but I think it is something that we need to touch on. That have you thought in this scenario, this is potentially where that type of clause could end up, as well as I see some pluses in it as well. So it's just that making sure we outline where it could go wrong, and qualifying residence restrictions. I know it talks to a person. To me, we need to get our heads around whether that person then has the ability, if they're a resident in Coromandel, they're a member of the local Forest and Bird, can they use Forest and Bird as a supporting organisation in a consent or something like that. So does it really rule out those ENGOs or as well as fed farmers and stuff like that?
So if I could just
organisations.
I did this exercise for myself last night, saying, okay, so who would that knock out of knockout of some of our processes. So for our regional coastal plan that we have appeals on at the moment, there would be forest and bird, seafood industry representatives, Surf Break Society, EDS, Greenpeace, Sport Fishing Council, Federation of Commercial Fishermen and World Wildlife Fund. Probably wouldn't be able to appeal. Yeah, you say. Some may say, oh, that's not good. So plan change 1, submitters, not appeals, because I thought I'd go to the submitters there of our 1,000. Acre, Fish and Game, Federated Farmers, Hort NZ, Farmers for Positive Change, Drainage Committees, Aggregate Association, Hamilton Waikato Tourism, Resident and Ratepayers, Charitable Trust, Hill Country Farmers, Lakes and Waterways, Farmers, a particular farmer group, catchment groups, New Zealand Forest Owners, New Zealand Grain and Seed, New Zealand Pork Industry Board, Sheep and Beef, Beef and Lamb, New Zealand Forestry Managers, Community Boards. So none of those entities would be able to input.
So I think it's key that our submission covers what the problem that the government's trying to solve with that sort of wording, and I'm not sure what that is. I can see, malicious submitters and stuff like that, but I think it oversimplifies, the process and potentially legally challenged and that sort of thing. So you don't really have the answer around the wording, but it's certainly something that
Yeah,
needs
it's
to be.
it is definitely something we wanted to steer from councillors on.
Okay. Yep, I'll jump around the room. Liz.
Most of my stuff has been answered, actually. Thank you. For me, national standards are really important, what's coming, because I think that will replace a lot of what we've been utilising, or the tools that we've been able to use before on a lower level. So yeah, really, really critical, but we don't know them. So my only point is, and this is me sitting I have been a commissioner for the last 12 years, and that is, I understand the need for change of the RMA. I mean, it has been very cumbersome, but sitting with a minister last week, there will be 45% less consents required. And I get that, and that's great. But you have good developers and you have not so great developers. So I appreciate the need for productivity and the need for, getting the country moving again. I get that. There's some parts of the country that do that exceptionally well, and I'm going to say Waipaha is probably one of them. We're growing quickly. Hamilton City is the same. There's parts of the region that need some more help, and we want to see more productivity. But there are good developers and there are not so good developers. And I have an email right now of a not so good developer, and this is where someone is going to miss out, or there's going to be a detrimental effect somewhere, and we're not going to capture it all. It's just going to be the reality. So we will lose some environmental momentum, I think, but it is finding that balance, and I'm hoping that the national standards will kind of, when we see those, that will hopefully fill some of the concerns and the gaps that I probably currently have.
Thanks, Liz. Noel.
Yeah, just thanks, Warren. Just talking to the issues that you raised, as you highlighted, prohibited down to be permitted. The issue there is doing away with some of those categories. Reading the government's intention, they're going to slide down into whatever they call them, whether they keep the same names or otherwise. But therefore, you then get into those who are for that and those who are against. So we're back to litigation. And that's my very point that I made to Tracy earlier on, is that we've spent over the last 30 years hundreds of millions of dollars, possibly billions or more, in fighting and defining the legislation and appealing it, and even words have been through incredible processes. So, yeah, if we don't want to do that all over again, which I can see happening, sadly, is that the community, while it may be the government's intention to get rid of 45% of the consents, unless it is absolutely defined to the nth degree, we set ourselves up for a new round of litigation. And I just am really concerned, and it needs to be kept simple, but how do you achieve that unless you go into definition to the nth degree? So for everything that we want, there'll be those opposed to it, and that will fight it through the courts. So all I can see happening, and as an ex-commissioner, I too see the need for reform and have for several years, many years. But the reality is, this is just setting the lawyers up to make a hell of a lot more money, sadly. And I'm not sure if it's really going to benefit the community at large.
I think the way we would capture it, and we've kind of touched on it, but actually around certainty of legislation, certainty of national direction, and also hopefully simplification of process as much as possible. And so we'll reiterate those points. But we could make it all permitted, but yeah, you might have to find some additional funding for monitoring.
I was looking for more work as a commissioner.
Oh, right, roger that.
Chris, so,
Missed that.
yes. Chris,
Yeah, thanks, Warren. Look, I just want to go back to the point that you raised, Warren, and Noel has touched on too. This qualifying resident restrictions. Now, my understanding is this new legislation is supposedly simplifying the whole process by making it very clear as to who can have inputs into issues where it's necessary to have consents issued. And that is to landowners only. Nobody else matters. So the vexatious litigants that Warren's referring to, who could go and buy 20 square metre block to become a qualifying resident restrictions, we need to make sure that that sort of behaviour is excluded. These have to, the qualifying resident restrictions for me make absolute sense. They will simplify the whole process, provided it's not allowed to be hijacked by these people who've got to make a profession like lawyers. That's their profession, finding ways around it. And whatever happens in the new legislation, I'm absolutely in support of the resident restrictions, but it needs to be strong enough to ensure you don't get these vexatious people that love making trouble, and that's how they make their living. So whatever we need to do in there to support it, I'm happy to put my name to it.
So can I just come back to that?
yeah, before Tracy comments, yep.
Yeah, look, I'm concerned, and while I agree with the sympathy that you both have raised, is that it will be easier to find someone in an area that will put their name to something, because I've been involved in community things where there's opposed power stations and all sorts of things. So it's going to be difficult finding that willing. It won't be hard for people to find a willing person to put their name on a document, and all the costs and lawyers and everything, and they will just sit there in name only. They won't have
Behind it, yeah.
yeah, and so maybe trying to make something. They might be they won't achieve anything, because there's ways and means already that people use to beat the system. So the more you try to defeat the system, or sorry, to take those people out, the more opportunities arise. Having seen it for, I've been involved in the law in different forms for over 40 years. Be careful what you wish for.
Well, my understanding, Noel, is that they're trying to get those people out of the system, but I'm interested in what Tracy's suggestion is, how we get around it.
Just trying.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Brent wants to say something. I also just want to say a question back to you. So qualifying resident, being that it is locked down to those people, also is in tandem with the provisions on notification and who can input, which are more constricted than what we've got at the moment. So that's what's been proposed. Question, Chris, in terms of qualifying resident, do you see it being different for those going through consent processes and those who have an ability to input into plans and policies? So
there has to be a difference. Like
Okay.
the
Okay, that's
resident
helpful.
restrictions is
That's
property
helpful.
ownership, all right?
Yep.
That's very different. to me.
Thank you. That's helpful. Yep.
Yeah, that's,
Thank you. Yeah, no, and that's why I just wanted to differentiate that. Sorry, Brent.
I just wanted to provide a bit of context which might help, that within this region and around the country, 98 to 99% of resource consents are processed on a non-notified basis. Just provides the context that's of when we're talking about the qualifying persons and the notification, it's at very, very sharp end of the total consenting spectrum across the country. And also the unintended consequences, and I know Chris has shared this with you before, but I'll share an unintended consequence that could happen if this isn't worded well. This council in this region has a massive interest in a resource consent application that will take place in Horizons, the diversion of water into the Lake Taupo catchment. If the legislation is worded in such a way that this council or its following on agencies has no ability to have input into that because you're not a qualifying resident, I just use that as one example around the unintended consequences that I know that Tracy's looking to try to convey to everybody in the room about how do you get the things that have been described here about people who vexatiously get involved with stuff that they have no right to be involved with, acknowledging it's a very sharp end of that pencil, and the things that you don't want to be excluded from having your say about. I just leave there.
To go further on, sorry, Mr. Chairman, just
Yeah.
further on, then you've also got the entities of the new JMA, Tūwhatitua JMA, which takes in the attributes and the catchment. So it's kind of like a domino. There's a domino effect right down. It's not just one, this qualified resident restrictions, not one. It can go a huge amount of area through a huge different iwi, regional horizons and
Can I just,
Yeah, while we're on the same topic, we'll stick there. Yeah, happy with that.
just to explore Ben's comment. Brent, I would have thought, I guess you're talking about Rangiparai.
The TVD diversion that diverts
Yes.
20%. Yeah.
So for me, that's a nationally significant, that's a national project. I don't see that as something that which the regional council would get involved with. Quite honest, if there was an issue around that, it would be handled at ministerial level, not at regional council or whatever that may be. Don't see that as being a reason why you wouldn't put that in there.
Just
Makes sense?
Yes, my point is about unintended consequences, and it's similar to what talking about in the Taupo catchment. I think we've heard this earlier. There seems to be a flavour through the changes which has a real genesis around activities within land use consents within urban areas, around neighbours and what have you getting involved that shouldn't be getting involved with things, as opposed to broader environmental impacts. Because something that happens, and I think that was what Mikhail was alluding to, something that happens in Taupo has an effect in the lower Waikato. Those catchment scale things, people have an interest which is beyond the area within which they own a property. And how do you give effect to the intent that's described about processes being slowed down because of people being vexatious? First, people have the right to have a say about something which is happening around an environmental matter, which is an impact and may not necessarily own a piece of land in that particular area. They're tricky, which I think is what Tracy's alluding to, how to get those settings right to achieve the outcome without those unintended consequences.
Sorry, Warren, but the guidance is really useful, that difference between the property scale consent stuff, we get it. Also, just a reminder that vexatious and frivolous submitters are different to what we're talking about here. They've got a whole different test. But I get the scale, the property level scale, even some of it might apply in some of our consenting, but in some of our more integrated consenting packages that we undertake with water, maybe even in some of our coastal consents, that ability for the qualifying resident to not include some of those sector entities, I guess, representatives is important. Yeah.
Do you have a follow-up, Chris, or something different?
Tricky one.
Okay, I'll go to Ben. Eddie.
So I agree with Gary.
Houseless.
I agree with Gary
Yes,
that
that's
a lot of what's being said in here is almost too negative in its approach. And for example, item number 7A requiring all goals across both bills to be considered at key decision-making points such as plan drafting, and considering. It almost negates the whole purpose of having the two separate bills. So we seem to be pushing back at key issues, as well as amending the plan hierarchy to place national environment plans above land use plans. If they've set them out in this way, we seem to be pushing back. But got a very detailed submission here. I don't think the government's going to listen to most of it, given the timeframes. So I would like to highlight the things they will listen to. And I think the point that's just been raised is really significant. And that is that you raised the issue of the coastal plan and suggested that most of the people who submitted on them, who should be submitting, like seafood industry, et cetera, wouldn't be allowed to under the current proposed rules for qualifying persons.
Sorry, that they were appeals to the coastal plan, not submissions. So yeah,
But either or. So I
that
think
it
we
may
need,
negate them. Yep.
well, we need to make a clear difference. So the one thing they get is that
Yes.
a plan
That's
is
what we've-
different than
we heard
this.
that from Robbie.
And that point needs to be made more clear and brought right up the front. And if in the oral submissions, it's the one thing that they hear, that's where you might actually make a significant change to what will otherwise hamstring us. I noticed that when you get to point 82 about the qualifying resident, it doesn't actually, it's not particularly strong in what it's suggesting. And I agree with the idea that reasonableness of a submission is subjective, and that you shouldn't be allowed to say this is an unreasonable submission, we don't want to hear it. That's an important point. As regard regulatory relief, I don't know that we should ask to be removed from the bill. I think we should point out that it's going to cause us problems, and that there will need to be funding to allow for that. But I'd like to hear what other people think. Should we actually say that if we make a decision on an SENA and it affects somebody's ability to develop their land, that we then have to pay them money? That's what regulatory relief's about. Yes, I wonder, yeah, well, at the moment we're suggesting it should be removed from the bill. I wonder, question, how does that apply to PC1? If PC1 comes in and we are saying to farmers that you cannot use this particular piece of land and you have to fence it and et cetera, do we have to pay regulatory relief for that if it's in a plan change?
It only applies to the specified topics. So there's a
Okay, so
small
only the
list.
SNAs, the biodiversity and the marine site.
The regulatory
And,
relief.
and so there's the specified topic.
Yeah.
And then I thought there were provisions
Oh,
that
sorry.
said substantial impact on the use of land. That's a question that I asked MEP officials directly. They said, we don't think it applies to. So I've said might be useful if we have that clarified.
Yes.
Because you cannot comply with national direction and government legislated treaty settlements that require you to do things on one hand.
Yep.
That is a requirement and why we have done plan change one. And on the other hand, have to compensate people. That's going to happen. That compensation should come from central government. And
Except, as you note earlier, part of this process is where the bills require, number 21, a single independent hearings panel to be set up. But who's going to pay for the central government hearings panel? And yeah, 25B, considering sources of funding, who's going to resource these things? There's a lot of things in here which are unfunded mandates yet again. And the other point was, I think.
Sorry, Ben, just to jump on that point, there are all those provisions that no doubt the cost will fall to local government. That of course a minister can there are provisions in here for ministerial override powers. So you've made that investment, but so those are things that I was talking about in terms of things don't quite tie together nicely.
Robbie, the other one here is another class of activity, permitted activities with registration. I think that's a significant point there, that you're actually going to create a whole lot more work, where in actual fact, you've got permitted activities at the moment. You're now going to make them permitted activities, but you've got to register them and be notified. So that I agree with the point here. It should be a separate category. So there's permitted activities and then there's ones with registration if required, because otherwise you're actually adding work to what are existing permitted activities.
And I think what's important there in those provisions is also the difference in monitoring that's required. The
Yeah.
difference between our proactive monitoring program and our reactive. Chris and I were talking about this the other day, and just again, who pays that, and our ability to take for that proactive monitoring associated with that activity, as opposed to reactive monitoring once things have been granted. So I think it's not only the cost of this new permitted activity class, but the ongoing maintenance of that and our ability to charge for those costs, given rates capping, given X, given Y. And Chris or Brent's going to jump in there.
Yeah, if I could just add to it first. And the whole idea of proactive monitoring was to show that your policies and things actually work. The idea of the reactive monitoring is checking people comply. And they're two different things. And I know this government's been pretty, is pretty strong on user pays. And so we can see one of the imposts of this is that there's going to be much more property owner costs because of they've got these permitted activities.
So I guess in summation then is I would make some of the points that we think they're actually going to listen to, that they need to listen to, come right up the front. One of those would be the qualifying residents relating to plan changes, but secondly would be that permitted activities with registration. And the debate for others was whether they think regulatory relief should be removed from the bill or not. Not certain.
Did you want me to make a comment there, Tracy?
Yeah.
Yeah, the registration one's is a tricky one, isn't it? Because there are circumstances when registration may well be an appropriate thing. For example, Plan Change 1 has a registration pathway so that this council can manage resources. The challenge with it is about the blanket. And I think that's what the submission talks about, everything needing to be registered. And what is the resource management purpose for that? Because it adds a cost burden to resource users and there may not be a resource management purpose. So it's been a bit of a one size fits all in registration because there are certain situations where it's fully appropriate. But then it goes on to say that the council must monitor. And of course, this council has 70 plus permitted activities, which it proactively monitors a few, because you put in place permitted activities because you want generally for people to be able to get on with their lives with limited regulatory intervention. But there's some of them, you know, in the spectrum of permitted activities that require a little bit of proactive oversight. But this is must. It creates a burden for the landowner and for the council. They're putting in some cost recovery parts, but as we all know, there's a whole bunch of costs to set up an administrative system to run a business that don't necessarily get covered by costs from transactional interactions. And if there's a large number of consents that go from consents to this quasi place, right now those administrative costs, as you'll all be aware, are picked up by consent holders through the consent administration fee. And it's not a directly proportionate. You have a few less consents, all your administration costs go down proportionally because you still need the systems and all that sort of stuff. You all know that. And so there's a cost that comes with that, let alone for the regulated party. Some of them require that regulated party to actually go out and provide information as part of a permit activity that shows that they've identified the affected persons and got those affected persons' approval, which adds another complexity for the party who believes that they're operating as a permitted activity, that they're kind of having to do a bit of a quasi-consent process, which comes back to my comment before. It seems to be written in a way which works in a territorial urban area where the party you're talking to is your direct neighbour. My building is going to be a bit closer to the boundary. Is that okay with you? Yes, it's okay with me. It becomes far more challenging when you have to identify affected persons in an environmental construct, which is kind of the theme that I read into this, that there's some good ideas in here, but the practical application of these could be really challenging and costly for councils. and some of the policy officials that are helping government write this may not have the same practical experience of implementing things and knowing what costs would be borne by ratepayers. So that's.
So you're really suggesting remove the word must?
Yeah, so I am suggesting remove the word must, but I don't know what to replace it with. There's got to be, because it's difficult for the government, because they don't want things randomly all around the country. But how do you have something which has for a genuine resource management purpose? Because if there's no resource management purpose for registration, why do it?
I'll jump in with another one. Just going back to 42 and the climate change, our recommendation. I just don't see how we can tie existing legislation to what might be future climate adaptation legislation.
So with that, we've got government already signalling the Climate Change Response Act and that it will be implemented prior to the development of spatial plans. So that's a public commitment that they. Where's my document of love here? Yeah, so they're looking to enact that bill kind of by mid this year in order to inform spatial planning processes. So we thought, hey, it's something that they've been out publicly on. Why don't we reference and again make sure it's part of that integrated approach and sequencing? Okay. Yeah, otherwise we wouldn't kind of crystal ball gaze as much.
Yep, okay, no, take it on board. Chris.
Thanks, Warren. I'd just like to go back to Brent. Sorry, Brent. No, this is a practical situation. I saw a letter that was signed off. It wasn't signed by you, it was signed by you. Requesting, this is for a consent for a quarry. And this letter went to 15 different iwi groups, all seeking their views on mission to support to oppose consenting for that quarry. How do you see your approach would be under the pending legislation applied to that situation? Does that make sense or not?
Why don't I start and then good job I've got actually my consents manager beside me and one of our senior advisors, and they can correct me when I get it wrong. It's not the current situation is challenging, as you know, Chris, because all of those 15 hapu all have an interest in the natural resources in that area, and the law requires to consider the impacts on those that are exercising their kaitiaki in that area. The way that you understand those impacts is that you hear from them for them to tell you how it's impacting on them, and so that's the challenge, isn't it? That's the current law. The way that the law is currently structured in terms of qualifying persons, I'm presuming that they would have the same status as a qualifying person in the area if they have land in the area.
Well, no, they're not.
I was posing that question to one of my folks.
They wouldn't be qualifying persons, as I understand it, under the new legislation. The reason that you were able to tap them into this, because there was a theory that was going to be uncontrolled runoff going into the waterways. So therefore that had to be ticked off by the iwi all the way down the waterway, down the heads. They're not resident.
The provisions probably, Brent, just to climb in, and we're all learning the provisions of the Act, but the provisions of the Act uphold treaty settlements and the requirements of treaty settlements.
Didn't ask for us.
The joint management agreements, the joint management agreements that stemmed the treaty settlements, again, statutory documents, have requirements in there for us to notify where it's within.
Can I just explain that there's a difference between, sorry, Chris, but there's a difference between their approval being required and the requirement to undertake our statutory role around assessing the effects of an activity, including effects of activities on iwi Māori. And so the letters that I think you're describing, Chris, would have been letters which have said, have you heard back from these parties? What have you heard from these parties? What what consultation has been undertaken with those parties and what is the feedback from that, because that informs then the next stage of the process, which is a notification decision. That specific one, I don't know whether or not it ended up in notification or not, but the way that you make those decisions is that you get information to inform that. And it is complicated in that we have a number of iwi hapu who will have overlapping interest in a particular area. And if under the current legislation, one did not consider that, the council becomes suddenly exposed to judicial review through High Court because we haven't made an appropriate notification decision because we didn't seek that information to be able to inform that decision. And so I hear what you're saying, Chris, about how do you make that less complex in the future, but we're not qualifying persons as the way to do it or not.
Well, I don't care how it's done. I just want to see that removed from the future because that's what's causing the frustration around the place. That's what the government's doing this stuff for. Try and stop that behaviour.
As you say, in that instant, we would not be captured under the qualifying resident definition, but, and I don't know, Chris, I haven't had, I don't know these as well as I know the existing legislation. There may be provisions in there in terms of iwi input and iwi consultation. We'll have a look at that and just make sure that the two aren't counterintuitive and they are there, as Brent said, for resource management purpose.
Hey, Chris, your mic.
Look, I'm happy to support consultation with a group that's going to represent the whole. One person to represent the whole. The way we go about it at the moment is expensive, time-consuming, and frustrating for the people that are having to deal with. So my understanding is that whatever we need to do to pass those, to communicate that to the law drafters, then I would encourage you to do so, please, Tracy.
Right. There's a couple of things I thought that some of the councillors may pick up on. So just testing the waters. Obviously in the schedules, you've got duties of farm operators and we make some comment around that, and also the powers of entry, etc. So I take it councillors haven't raised it, so they're happy with what's in our submission? In the schedule 5, I think it is. But that's, yeah. So in our one, so sorry, schedule 5's in the actual bill itself. If you go, sorry. Yep, 100%. I can't believe you guys haven't. So page 119.236 relates to the main duties of farm operators. And the powers of entry, I can't find that relative to our submission, sorry.
Just if I can just highlight something for councillors, in terms of the emergency provisions and emergency works provisions. I mean, we have in our submissions highlighted a lot of things where the way the things are crafted don't actually match with reality, don't actually match with what we've experienced in Rudd, and said, you need to loosen up what you've got here, guys. So just in terms of the response to, there's a lot of negativity. This is one area where we've kind of gone, hey, you need to do better here because what you're proposing is actually not going to work in practice and going to be problematic. So I just wanted to point that out. Why I pointed that out is on the last 3 or 4 pages of the submission, and you might not have got to it. Other than Warren, who's getting the gold stars up there.
So I'll jump to Noel. Yep.
Well, powers of entry, look, I haven't read it. I haven't got access to my machine at the moment. The reality for me is that nobody should have power of entry unless under warrant, unless an emergency situation. So if that's what it's saying, I would agree with it.
So where it qualifies that there must be an officer involved in that is into properties, not onto land. So that's why I raised it. Are people happy with it? Look, we can take it online, and if you look up those pieces of the legislation, then I'm sure Tracy's happy to take some email guidance as long as it's circulated with everybody.
That raises the very point that I alluded to earlier, is that they're introducing properties and land. Now, one and the same, as far as I'm concerned, but, you know, because any property generally has land underneath it, or, you know, whatever.
Yep.
So if they're using two different words for the same thing, ridiculous. Nobody should be able to enter unless it's an absolute emergency.
Have you looked at this?
Didn't regulate the
Brett?
way-
Just-
That particular section, no, so I'll ask the team to bring it to my attention. Of course, the current legislation talks about dwelling houses, eh? So if you,
Maybe dwellings rather than properties, I may have used the wrong word.
yeah, so currently you can't go into a dwelling house without the police.
Yeah.
Currently, you can go onto a property, subject to your warrant, but there are restrictions on when you can go. So there are restrictions when you can go under your warrant versus when you would need a search warrant from the court to go on. And it's all about technical. Come to EPC, I'll get Patrick to explain it. It's all about reasonable cause to believe. If you're just going out to monitor something, you can go on under your warrant. But if you have reasonable cause to believe that an offence has been committed, then you would need to go on under search warrant. So there's a whole bunch of legalese about that. But going into dwelling houses always needs police. And we never go into dwelling houses.
It's a need for an environmental agency to do that.
We never go into dwelling houses, but we go into land, properties, whichever way you want to call it, every day of the week and every day of the week under the warrants.
Leave it the same. Leave it the same, and then you don't bring in a new dimension for litigation.
Well, I certainly agree with you there that as soon as you bring in a different word, lawyers will believe that the legislators had a purpose for bringing in that different word,
That's
therefore
right.
it must mean something different,
What
and
was the
therefore need to
intent
go
of the
through
change?
what was the intent of the change, and then you spend all this time in Hansard, and there's no intent in there, so then you go to the courts to interpret it, and it creates confusion unnecessarily.
That's my point. So,
Okay, that, it was just something I'd read through, so I just, as long as you farmers are happy, then that's good with me. Exactly, Ben.
Just going to ask, number 43, council recommends regularly reef positions be removed from the bill. Is that something we want to state, or is it we simply going to raise the problems of the regulatory relief that will affect us with PC1, 200,000 SNAs, the costs involved? I mean, are we going to actually oppose it, or are we just going to say this is a
Can you
problem?
just leave that with us and we'll have another crack at that? To be fair, I didn't get a yes or a no. I've got individual yeses and nos, and mindful we haven't got a bunch of other councillors here. So just leave that with us and we will rework it. We'll have another crack at it. And then we will have councillors in the room and we'll be able to get that clear steer of what we have in the submission.
Gary.
Oh, well.
Just a quick comment. I didn't know if I raised it before, but I'll just want to make a point of it again now. Point 49 about the gold rush. What you were talking about earlier on.
Yep.
You know, I think that's highly speculative. And I do know of farmers who have fenced off areas which they want to protect it, you know, for kaikatea and things like that, and not bother to register them or anything else because of the legislation that goes with it. So they do it at their own cost without any compensation at all because they do want to protect it. So I suppose once again it's about language and you know things like gold rush and that. It's speculative, and I reckon it should be just not be part of our submission at all.
Okay, yep, I will take that on board. I've also worked in years ago in a TA where we introduced some of these provisions, and there was, in fact, I wouldn't call it a gold rush, but there were definitely a bunch of people who planted 3 Cody trees and decided to get a protection lot from that, and they died a year later. So yeah, we'll soften it. Understand what you say there, but it is looking at what Warren said, a potential worst case scenario. So I think just to spell out these things might happen, might not, but we will have a look at that. We'll change that terminology. But you're right, and I guess part of me is also I've seen nothing in my reading of the acts, the bills, and I haven't read them as detailed as others in the room. Nothing that recognises those people who've done good. You know, that was a key issue through Plan Change 1. What about those people who have taken the effort, made that investment? You know, we are from a regulatory relief perspective saying, oh no, we'll compensate you, but there's nothing built into the legislation that compensates people who've already done good things. So, well, we're gonna start compensating people from now on. Thanks, Warren.
Right, is there anything else for anybody?
It's not the last you'll see of it.
I realise that, so I would encourage councillors, if you do pick up extra things, specifically if there's some specific points or anything, please circulate it with everybody. We don't want to get to a position where we come back and restart relitigating bits and pieces. If we're across what people are thinking, it just makes our choices a lot easier. Sorry, Tracy.
Oh, I was just going to say, there's a couple of slides,
Yep.
Brooke, if you can tootle through. Sorry. That's a recap on the timelines. If we just go to the next, talked about that. Next slide. So, if you thought that these were the only submissions going on, no, there's a couple more. Just the next slide, Brooke. So these will come to Stratton Pole. Miffy, did you want to just do?
So there's two related bills, which you've possibly heard about. So they're around development levies, which are replacing development contributions, and amendments to the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act. And they are mostly focused at TAs. So it's about how you fund urban growth. However, we have put together fairly minor submissions that are basically saying, hey, think about us too. When urban growth happens, it does impact on some of our functions and responsibilities, and we'd like the option to be able to use these levies and funding and financing tools. So that's in a nutshell what those are about. So just saying, hey, pretty supportive of what you're doing, but please let regional councils have the option to use them.
And importantly, in the development contributions one, we're advocating for the ability for whoever has the regional council functions for catchment management, drainage, river management, and potentially public transport, that there's an ability to take a development levy, because at the moment we're left out of those conversations and they are significant and do have impacts. Thank you, councillors.
You. There were two little bits and I can't find it in all my scribble, but one was the internal waters of the Coromandel.
Oh, yes. So that was just an
And my
idea.
reading of that is it's not coastal, it's internal. Is that how you read that?
No.
Okay.
I just didn't quite understand what was actually meant.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I thought there's probably 3 people who have very clear understanding and a bunch of others who don't. So it was just something I wanted to go back and check, understand whether it was defined by virtue of a survey plan in the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park Act or not.
Yeah.
Again, it's that whole why introduce a new term if there's one we can use. So it was just double checking that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And the other one was it Minister's interest in the CMA? Was there something around that? And I think there was no definition around what that might mean.
Okay. Yes.
So,
Katrina?
yeah,
Yeah,
so, yeah,
that was a submission point, exactly that, just seeking that
Clarity.
phrase was used, but just seeking that it either be defined or there be a bit more detail put
Clarity
around it in the
around it.
bill so that it was clearer.
Yeah.
Okay.
So rather than have a minister interested, actually a defined land parcel or responsibility
Is that-
ground.
What is that?
Yeah.
Okay, no, thank you. That ticks those 2 boxes. Sorry, Ben.
Just very briefly, how do you see this playing out in terms of submission? I note that you're planning to give an oral submission to,
Select committee, yes.
Select committee.
As I said, that would likely be via Warren and Chris. Yeah.
and
We've asked for the ability to do that.
Yeah,
Whether
yeah,
that's
yeah.
granted or not is another thing.
Yep, 10 minutes. That's what all our previous ones have been. That's why we cut to the chase and highlight our key issues.
yep, that's fine. And so their time frame in terms of what they have to do, they've got to turn this into legislation and then
Correct.
get it into the House and get it through by,
June is the indication.
right,
This is of everything that the government needs to do in its next 7 to 8 months. So rises on the 24th of September. You look at sitting days and non-sitting days. Probably got 6 months left to actually do some work. This has been identified as a priority for the government. RM reform. So it doesn't give us a lot of time, but what it does give us is priority in that. And what we have heard from officials is once they've seen the whites of the eyes of the submissions, actually they'll be able to give us a better indication of timing.
So it would be useful to clarify whether PC1 is part of the regulatory relief.
So
or
I
not.
asked our lawyers to make inquiries of the court. I'm not seeing it in any email train. What the registrar said is that it is being worked on. So that's positive.
Excellent. No, thank you very, very much. And please pass on my gratitude to you guys here. You can hear it for yourselves, but I'm sure that all the staff around that have been part of this process over what was a very short time frame, and mixed in with a holiday period. So I'm sure there's been some sacrifices made, and as councillors, we certainly appreciate all the work and the thorough document that has been presented to us with the information that we know to date. So thank you very much in that space.
Yeah.
That pile that Tracy's got there, plus the pile that arrived. Yeah. Yeah, no, I got the act right here in front of me. So I'll now hand over Chris to close with the Karakia.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. Thanks, councillors. Unahia mai te uru tapanui, kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te hininaro. E te ara takatu, koe rā e rongo, whakaria aki ki runga, kia tina, haumia, hui au,
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Warren.